Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor John Bikofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to part two of the topic on child labor with a special focus on the chocolate industry and the primary, namely cocoa, which comes, or cacao, which comes from primarily from West Africa. The majority of the raw material comes from West Africa, and where there is a very large number of the labor force that is below the age of 18, which according to the United Nations constitutes child labor. Many of those children are trafficked. They are in parallel involved in slave labor. That is, they can go to a number of without paying food and sustenance just to keep them working. Not all of those children come where the cocoa farms are located. For example, in the Ivory Coast, the biggest producer of the product, children come from Mali, and Burkina Faso, from the neighboring countries, to work there, and they are even more vulnerable to trafficking and slave labor precisely because these children are alone in a foreign country and need to work in order to survive. This problem is well known to the United Nations, to one of the arms of the United Nations called the International Labor Organization, ILO, and I will be referring to that as I did in part one. The ILO, among other organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and others, do keep some statistics. It is very difficult, I want to caution people, because those who may want to research this further will seek statistics all over the map. That's understandable. It is very difficult to keep track of child labor, whether it's in Africa, in South Asia, in Brazil. Very difficult, especially when there are armed gangs involved in trafficking, in human trafficking. And it is fear, basically, let's face it, human fear precludes people from going too far and looking into this. There have been investigative reports, some very fine investigative reports, some coming from US-based independent media sources, small independent groups, media sources, some from France, some from the UK, namely to expose the child labor phenomenon, which, by the way, is a human rights violation according to the United Nations. It's a human rights violation. The beneficiaries of all of this, as you can imagine, are not necessarily the producers, the farmers for which the children work. They are actually, when you break down the income, what you find is that the beneficiaries are the wholesalers. We begin with the wholesaler who buys the raw product, to the manufacturer, to the retailer. That's where the money is made. It is estimated between 4 and 6% goes back to the farmer, and a tiny percent and a tiny fraction of that goes to the workers, and even smaller to the children, child labor. It is true that the chocolate industry has a dark secret, as many have argued. However, it is a dark secret. I want to clarify this. Not for governments. They are well aware, whether it's the governments in Africa or Western governments. It is not a dark secret for the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that makes loans to these governments for monetary stabilization, to stabilize their currency when they have hyperinflation. Not a secret for them. They know. Not a secret for the World Bank, that makes agricultural development loans, okay, to large corporate farms. They know. It's not a secret to the United Nations, not a secret to the ILO, and it is especially not a secret to the corporations making an estimated 150 billion. By the way, you'll see different figures, but you have to zero in on the year. That will explain why the difference in the figures between 116 and 160 billion. In any case, it's a $150 billion industry. It is a simple matter of profits. As I stated in part 1, no government, no international agency, no investor, no bank financing the chocolate companies. By the way, banks are financing chocolate companies. No billionaire, Western billionaires, are investors in these companies. Some of the biggest, most influential, most prominent billionaires in the West, especially in the US, influential in public policy, by the way, have investments in this industry, which uses child labor. One might argue, so do cell phones and laptops and electric cars. That's also true. That does not make this any less of a human rights violation, according to the United Nations Human Rights Commission. This is the United Nations Human Rights Commission that has concluded for a long time now that this is a human rights violation. Nor does this mean that it's any better just because they say to themselves, well, we'll talk about the excuses they bring up, whether it's ignorance or we're addressing this issue, or blaming someone else. Nor does this mitigate the conditions which are hazardous, unhealthy, and unsafe for those children in the farms. I want to begin, this is for a preface. I want to begin, I already went through part 1, and I'm not going to rehash the whole background, historical background of child labor through history, from ancient times, China, India, ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, through the Middle Ages, industrial capitalism. I covered that in part 1. I no point to recap that, except to say, by the way, only until the 19th century, civilization, human civilization, with no exception to nation states or empires, human civilization viewed child labor as the norm for roughly 5,000 years. It was the norm. It's only since the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century that there have been voices of concern about children coming from various circles, from academics, from women's groups, from trade unionists, from journalists, from some progressive politicians, and legislation that's really of any consequence, really coming in the 20th century. In the case of the United States, as late as 1938, under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who pushed the Fair Labor Standards Act, which covers trade union issues at large, but he covered child labor in there as well. My contribution, because by the way, I want to tell you that there are, if you want to see empirical studies, including videotape of the harsh conditions of these children, this isn't the tape. I'll tell you what my contribution to this topic is. You should go and find out, through Google research, read articles, books, as well as YouTube. There's some very good, some very credible YouTube primary material. That is where they had, with secret cameras, they went and filmed children working in the farms, the gangs, armed gangs, patrolling the farms to make sure intruders did not go in, human traffickers, the appalling conditions. You can do that. Now, what is my contribution to this? Really, as a historian who dealt and still deals with the international political economy, my contribution is to give you the context, an overview of how the chocolate industry's child labor dark secret fits into a larger problem of the world division of labor, and where Africa fits in the world economy. So as a historian who has taught and researched many of these issues over the years, decades, I should say, I want to give you that kind of background. First of all, Africa is the second largest continent behind Asia in the world. And it is the richest in raw materials. Agricultural land, precious stones, minerals. It is, in fact, a very, very rich continent. Africa, for 500 years, has been undergoing a process of underdevelopment. This is going to be my thesis, that Africa, and by the way, there are academic books, scholarly books on this topic, you can investigate further. Africa has been underdeveloped by the Europeans. Before the Portuguese descended in the late 15th century, and then followed by other Europeans, and began to formally colonize Africa. Africa was undeveloped. There is a huge difference between undeveloped and underdeveloped. What happened is that the Europeans went in. Most of you, many, probably all of you know that Africa initially was exploited for one commodity: human beings, captured as slaves and transported across the Atlantic by the West Europeans. The number one slave trading operator was England, transporting slaves, making huge profits in slavery, and transporting them to the so-called New World, namely the Western Hemisphere, where they worked primarily in plantations, whether it were in the Caribbean, the United States, the colonies, and then the United States, of course, once it became a nation state, and of course in Brazil. Africa's number one export was humans. They depopulated, the Europeans were depopulating Africa. At the same time, sub-Saharan Africa, by the way, and especially along the western coast. And at the same time, they were looking to exploit raw materials. They appreciated the richness of this continent, as I told you, number one in the world in raw materials. They appreciated the richness in raw materials, from minerals to forestry, to fisheries, to agricultural products, gold, diamonds, especially in Southern Africa, as you know. And so they began to exploit all of this. The process of underdevelopment begins, and here's what I'm going to introduce you to, the so-called dependency theory, which a number of scholars follow, especially African scholars, but but Western scholars as well, in order to put the whole issue of the current exploitation into the broader framework. Africa became, the whole continent, monocultural. That is, the colonists imposed monocultural development. They forced them to focus on the primary sector of production. The primary sector of production was mining, forestry, fisheries, agriculture, animal husbandry. Okay? The handicrafts industry, which made them self-sufficient, or everything else that made them self-sufficient, was sidetracked. They had to focus on those products which the Europeans used, especially the British, by the way, raw materials, including cotton, across from Chad to Egypt, which helped to power the Industrial Revolution. Cotton was king for the English Industrial Revolution. Coming from England doesn't produce cotton. Came from Africa. They used low-cost labor from Africa to get the cotton. The development of England, the industrialization of England, would not have been possible in the absence of underdeveloping Africa, forcing them to focus on the primary sector of production, export raw materials, and import finished products. The British and the Europeans, including the United States and Canada, by the way, continue doing this and still do to this day in much more subtle ways. I'll explain when we come to it. Cocoa is obviously one of the products, but they didn't do it just in Africa, by the way. I always like to remind people that Mahatma Gandhi, in encouraging his fellow citizens in India to remove the British and to get rid of British colonialism in India, they must stop buying their finished products, their manufactured products. Stop wearing their shirts and their pants. Make your own. Buy locally from others who make their own. Don't buy imported British products made in Manchester and Leeds. Buy locally made products. Stop buying them, Mahatma Gandhi told them, and they'll go. They're here for market share and raw materials. That's what they were there for. That's what they were in Africa for. So Africa, like India and the global South, were underdeveloped in order to develop the global North. Northwest Europe, the United States, and Canada. This process of development and underdevelopment, development and underdevelopment are two sides of the same coin. Like I said, you're not going to have industrial development in Northwest Europe when they lack the raw materials. Where did they come from? Where did those raw materials come from? They came from Africa. They also came, by the way, as I point out, from India, from Asia, and from other parts of Asia as well as Latin America. Okay? Europeans, by the way, including especially the British, were also exploiting the minerals and raw materials of Latin America as well. So the development underdevelopment debate is a north-south debate among scholars. This thesis, beyond politics, by the way, advanced in the 1950s in the United Nations by a couple of one Argentinian and one Brazilian scholars who worked for the UN at the time, argued that the underdevelopment of Latin America, in their case, of course, Argentina and Brazil, Latin America, and you can apply that to the globe. You apply that to the global South. The underdevelopment of the global South finances, makes possible the global North. They constantly found themselves in perpetual, unequal relationship in terms of the terms of trade. The terms of trade always favored the manufacturer, exporters from the West to the global South. Raw materials were very cheap. Value-added products, expensive. Raw materials, cheap. And this is the cocoa issue. When the cocoa farmers get 6%, 4 to 6% for the product, and the huge profits are made by the wholesaler, the manufacturer, and then the retailer, that's where the rest of the money goes. That is an example of what's going on right today, right now. Not colonial times, right now. Industrial Revolution of 18th century England. Okay? This is the reason that Africa has such a low share of GDP. It's only 2.7%. Although their share of global population is close to 20%. Okay? When you compare that with the United States, which is 4.5% of the global population and has about 26% share of the global GDP, you can see the point that I'm making, that the uneven terms of trade, an old debate pointed out, like I said, by the Brazilian and Celso Furtado, by the way, was his name, by the Brazilian economist at the United Nations in the 1950s. This is an old debate. The underdevelopment of Africa has been chronic, long-standing. And child labor today, illegal, by the way, a human rights violation, is an extension of this framework, which has to do with the terms of trade. Keep the cost of labor down. just as they did during the Industrial Revolution, when you had, including their own children, by the way, in England, they put their own children to work as well, in mines, in factories, warehouses, everything you can imagine, as I mentioned in part one. So it's not that they were a little bit kinder to their own children because they were of the same ethnicity, and then they were to the Africans. Now, we'll talk about the race factor, by the way, because there is a race factor here. Obviously, the Europeans had to manufacture. They had to manufacture a racist ideology and manipulate and use the racist ideology and use pseudoscientific ideologies like social Darwinism of the late 19th century, as many of you know, to justify what they were doing to Africans. As though if you use social Darwinism, okay, this white supremacist ideology, that justifies exploiting a 6-year-old girl in the cocoa farms. This is the morality of the West, historically, linked to the political economy. There is no excuse for this. You can't justify, you can't rationalize your way out of this in any way, shape, or form. They have tried, by the way. Believe me, they have. They're inferior. It's not our fault. Their parents send them to work. Why do their parents send them to work? Because their parents are underpaid, because they're part of the larger framework. They're part of the same political economy, part of the same global division of labor, which the West determines in Africa and has since the colonial era under developing Africa. Their parents were paid well. Why would they send their 7-year-old girl to work? A middle-class family in Manhattan wouldn't do that. Why would they do it? Are they any less human? Is that the assumption? So we have to be realistic about this. What is going on here? What is going on here is naked profiteering. The so-called dark history of chocolate is part of a larger problem. It's part of the development of the West and the status of the West, efforts to keep its hegemonic economic status in the world at the expense of the global South. And the chocolate industry, with cocoa as the primary product, the raw material, the cocoa industry is just a small part of that. And that is what we have to keep in mind. And it involves, by the way, human trafficking. It involves slave labor. It involves armed gangs. It involves assassinations. Okay. I want to move on to the number of children involved and in specific countries. In Ghana and the Ivory Coast, it is estimated, I caution, no one really knows. They can't possibly take an accurate count of how many of these little tykes are out there working in the farms, exploited in the farms. It is estimated 3 million just in those two countries. Okay. By the way, before I forget, cocoa, Mexican product, originally the Spaniards discovered cocoa. Ironically, again, just as an aside before I forget, the Portuguese actually initially introduced it, I believe in the early 19th century, not to Ghana or Ivory Coast. I believe it was Gabon, which is just south. And then, of course, cocoa became a very profitable product as in the 19th century, as the 19th century unfolds and the West develops a taste for chocolate, it becomes widespread in the farming field. And the reason it just dawned on me to mention this point about the product coming from Mexico, a lot of people know this anyway, and then introduced to West Africa. The reason is because from the 19th century to this day, interestingly enough, children were always working in the cocoa farms, and there was an element of slave labor since then, and it continues to this day. This is why I thought I would mention this, because of the historical continuity, so that you can see that the framework of the underdevelopment development dichotomy, this north-south dialectic, if you will, really has remarkable historical continuity. The Africa is continuing to be underdeveloped, and at the core, as Celso Furtado, the Brazilian economist at the UN, pointed out, is the issue of the terms of trade. And it's not just cocoa, by the way. I'm mentioning cocoa, okay, and I will focus on cocoa because that's the topic of this this video. But you can take any product. You can take cobalt, which exploits child labor in the Congo, and I mentioned some of this in the first part of this session. Or you can take the controversy in 2023, 2024 in Niger. The controversy there was that France was exploiting uranium in Niger. Is extremely poor. By the way, Africa, made up of 54 countries, is the poorest continent on the planet. Very rich, the richest in raw materials, poorest in living standards. Niger, uranium, very precious. When there was a coup d'etat and the French were kicked out, it was revealed by the officers who took over and threw out the French that the French were paying $4 or $5 per kilo uranium. It was also revealed what the international market price is, between $250 and $500. They were paying $5. This is an indication of how the West is underdeveloping Africa, continuing to underdevelop today. Because when they pay $5 for a product that's worth hundreds in the international market, then Niger is going to have, I'm sidetracking, but this is a very important issue, because I dealt for years in a number of publications I had with the issue of the IMF and World Bank loans on a world scale in different countries around the world, from Indonesia to Argentina and Chile. They're going to have a balance of payments deficit, in other words, a trade deficit. And they're going to have a current accounts debt. They're going to have problems with liquidity, raising money. They're going to print money that's going to create monetary inflation. That means their creditors are going to cut them off, commercial credit, banks and others. So they're going to go to the IMF for money. And then the IMF is going to impose austerity terms, cutting public spending, and is going to demand that they're even more generous toward foreign corporations like these exploiting, whether it's uranium, cobalt, or cocoa, lower their taxes, cut tariffs on imports from the West, cut social spending. So you see, there is nowhere to turn when the terms of trade, this is how important the terms of trade is, whether it's chocolate or any other product, it can be any product, any raw material. Because the raw material is always much cheaper in the global south, because the global north, the west, determines the terms of trade. The price of cocoa isn't determined by the farmers in the Ivory Coast and Ghana. It's determined in London and Chicago. The commodities exchange, they determine the price, not the farmer who produces the product. So then they find themselves in this dead cycle. So they borrow. And then they use assets from the product that they're exporting at ridiculously low prices to finance the interest on the loan they just made. So Africa has been historically perpetually in debt because of this. It's not just Africa, by the way. Apply that model to the global south. Look at what's happening in Argentina right now. Argentinians became so disillusioned, they elected this extreme right-wing neoliberal, Javier Milei is his name, the president of Argentina, who of course goes along with the IMF, but is sinking living standards even more in that country. So what you have is the structural global economy sinking the global south lower. And child labor is just a small component of that. The unique aspect of child labor is that they're children. And no matter how one tries to find some kind of an excuse to justify using child labor, it's illegal, it's a human rights violation, and it's immoral. No matter what kind of, and by the way, governments, as well as corporations, don't try to walk away from, they go, now of course we support of child labor. They always support it. They've been supporting it for 30 years, and it's actually growing. Child labor on a world scale is growing. And it's growing because of globalization in the last 35 years, which has deregulated the global economy and made easier capital flows between countries. And governments have been more accommodating toward corporations. I want to point out that there is another issue here that is part of the dark secrets of chocolate. I'm not going to mention the chocolate companies. They're mostly Western corporations. The investors are global, by the way. These are companies that are publicly traded. Many of the big billionaires in the United States and in Europe are investors. There's some investors from India, by the way. India is in there, some from China. I do want to mention, though, that another issue, which is a structural issue, and put this in a sub-framework, if you will, of the larger dependency theory that I mentioned already, and that is the informal economy of Africa. It is estimated that that 55% of the GDP of sub-Saharan Africa is generated from the informal economy. What do we mean by informal economy? The subterranean economy, outside the monitors of the government, no taxes, and so forth. The cocoa industry is part of the informal economy, by and large, by the way. Not entirely part of it. Part of it is in that area. The informal economy, the more underdeveloped the country is, the larger the informal economy. When you, if you, those of you who are interested, and especially those of you in international political economy, you can go, you can Google this, and you can look at informal economies by country, and you can see that when you, at the very top of the list are the least developed countries. The less the development, the greater the informal economy. This doesn't mean that the United States, by the way, and Europe don't have an informal economy. They do. In the United States, of course, much of the informal economy has been legalized. So you know, there is that. All that part of the neoliberal model, by the way, of deregulation. In Africa, the informal economy is an issue. Now, the one of the dark secrets of the chocolate industry is the involvement of armed gangs, invariably linked to human trafficking, and some, especially in the last 15, 20 years, in the international drug trade. Africa has become a hub, especially West Africa. It has become a hub for Latin American drug lords. They bring drugs from there to Africa and then ship them on to Europe. So that also, the drug trade, human trafficking, slave labor, this is all part of the informal economy. Okay. So what you have is a weak state structure. Let me explain that. The strong developed economies have a strong state structure. The strong state structure is there to support economic and social development. In the case of Africa, the social structure is very weak. This brings us to the issue of who is in the government. Here's where the West is pointing fingers at African politicians, saying, well, they're the ones who are corrupt. They're police, they're military, they're bureaucrats, they're politicians. They take money under the table. The question is, who's giving them the money? Whether it's in Nigeria, oil-rich Nigeria, whether it's the oil companies, or in the Congo, in the mines of Congo, or in the cocoa farms of West Africa, who is providing the cash to grease the wheels of government? You have to remember that Africa was colonized by Europe. When they decolonized Africa, as we saw recently, 23, 24 with Niger, they still left a bureaucratic structure on the colonial model with huge influence that continued. They didn't have direct colonial control of Africa, but they had huge economic influence and presence in the economy, exploiting the raw materials. Even in Nelson Mandela's South Africa, after apartheid, Nelson Mandela, to his credit, my God, did he ever go through agony to achieve what he did? However, in all fairness, when you look at who owns most of the income in South Africa. And the wealth and the raw material, the precious metals, diamonds and gold. Who is it? It's the white elite, foreign and domestic. So what you have in Africa, it's true that there is a comprador bourgeoisie class. In other words, a capitalist class whose fortunes are linked. This is also in Islamic Africa, that is across North Africa, where there are Muslim countries from Egypt to Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. All these countries, comprador bourgeoisie historically has been important during decolonization. It's no different in the Ivory Coast and Ghana producing the cocoa. Were it not for the collaboration, the chocolatiers in the West would not be able to be making the kinds of money and doing what they're doing in the industry. So the issue here is, it's true, it's not 100%. It's not by any means 100% the fault of the IMF and the Western banks and Western corporations. It takes collaborators at the local level. And there are at the politicians, bureaucrats, the military, and comprador bourgeoisie. That is a dependent capitalist class which is linked to the foreign corporate interests. And they are the facilitators making sure the white master makes the money in the Western world. Banks and investors, as I pointed out, Western banks and investors, are behind the chocolate companies. The chocolate companies would not be able to be doing what they're doing if the banks and the investors, the big investors, the billionaire investors, said to them, look, you're violating the human rights of African children. This is against the law. You shouldn't be doing this. They don't do that. They just figure, how much am I going to make this month, this quarterly report, profit report? That's the bottom line. Never mind that there are arms dealers linked to the slave trade here, drug dealers, armed gangs, never mind about that. And never mind that the social fabric of Africa is being undermined. When you undermine the children of a society, you're destroying the society. They know that. They don't need to be lectured on this. These are intelligent people, by the way, contrary to what a lot may assume. A lot of people may assume. These are intelligent individuals. They know that. They just figure my profit is above everything. The money I'm going to make comes first. Now, part of the problem, as I stated earlier, is indeed, and it's regrettable to say this, it's sad, it's tragic, racism. It amazes me, especially when I'm in Europe and I have European colleagues tell me, you know, and I'm mentioning this because Sunday there are runoff elections in France, and Marine Le Pen is more likely to win. The far right wing xenophobe and Islamophobe is more likely to win than anyone else. They go, well, you know, that we have a problem. Muslims from the Middle East and Africans come up here, threatening our social fabric, our way of life, taking jobs away from us, bringing down wages, putting wage pressure downward. The question is why. They never ask why. Never do they ask that the question of whether the Europeans in the last 500 years, this is not now or the last 200 years with the chocolate industry, this is not 200 years with the chocolate industry, but 500 years in the entire continent, Europe, underdeveloped Africa, and Africans were fleeing, a handful of them, millions of them involuntarily as slaves, by the way, but then others fleeing dire economic conditions. They were fleeing poverty, endemic poverty. Now, the World Bank comes along and says, well, we're all for sustainable development. We want to help legitimate crops. But then when you look at what their loans support, they support corporate farming using Western machinery, agrochemicals, and Western hybrid seeds, which undermines the small. That's another reason they force people. This is one dimension for migrants in Europe, which is their nightmare, by the way. Why do we have migrants coming in? They're undermining our European purity, which of course is underlying racism. They are undermining our European purity. Okay. Why are they doing this? Why are they doing this is the question. No one wants to leave their society voluntarily if they are doing well. People love the place they were born in and raised in, and they want to make a life for themselves and their families and their children. But if you force them through economic means, whether it's an IMF austerity programs that brings living standards down, or you have to sell your children for $20 to go and work in the cocoa farms, that's one reason they migrate. Or a more fiendish reason, war. When was the last time that Africa in the last 500 years declared war on Europe or invaded Europe or colonized Europe? One of the nightmares of African scholars, by the way, when you read African history, not from a Western perspective, but from the African perspective. For example, Chinwezu, in a book entitled The West and the Rest of Us, what you find is that the Westerners have this Eurocentric, Euro-Atlantic perspective that the world revolves around the West. It's the center of the universe. And that the rest of the planet is there to serve the West, whether it's the cocoa beans, it's the used for chocolate, or minerals, or whatever other product there is. It's there to serve us. Your labor is to serve us. They never ask, did those people ever do anything to undermine our living standards? Did they invade us? Who has caused, instigated wars and civil wars in Africa? Both sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's the Sudan or overthrowing regimes like in Libya. Never mind the reasons. The issue of national sovereignty is a matter for the people to decide. If they don't like Muammar Gaddafi, they can overthrow Muammar Gaddafi. It's not up to the French, the British, and the United States to send airplanes to bomb Libya and after that have a civil war and then have Libyans get on boats and go to Italy, primarily Italy, but other parts, Greece, France. And then the Europeans go, whoa, my God, what are the Libyans doing here? You bomb their country. That's what they're doing here. So the same thing with the same principle applies to economic underdevelopment. When you underdevelop their economy and they have child labor and slave labor conditions, of course there's gonna be an exodus of human beings. Human beings, like Charles Darwin pointed out, like all species, as he pointed out, all species want to perpetuate themselves and want to survive. It's a natural instinct of all species. Why should they be different? So this is the tragedy of Africa. Now, I want to, we're almost out of time. I want to conclude by pointing out that a couple of years ago, I think it was a couple of years ago, I wrote an article on the new partition of Africa. There is a new race for Africa. Africa is the new frontier, once again, by the way. Most of you know why, because of China. I talked in part one that China is hardly an innocent bystander here. They're there to exploit the raw materials of Africa. However, in addition to that, fair is fair. We have to look at the whole picture. Yes, they're there to exploit the raw materials of Africa. China sees its development as well, especially the Belt Road Initiative project. There's global infrastructure project that it has undertaken from Central Asia through the Middle East, through Africa, and into Europe, and they want to expand it to Latin America. They see global integration needing the richest country on this planet. That's Africa. There's no doubt about that. However, they are not as exploited. It's not that they're there because they're nice people. They are not as exploitative, and they do build hospitals, schools, roads. They do build sewage systems, water facilities. They are doing something for social development. This does not mean that China has not been involved in child labor, just like all Western chocolatiers, by the way. They have been. They're not guilt-free of that. The West, for its part, is using geopolitics with the military component, as many of you who follow these developments, whether it's in Libya or in Chad or in the Sudan, or in East Africa, by the way. And they point out, well, we have Muslim terrorists and they're the problem. They're causing all the problems. Or Nigeria, by the way. They're causing all the problems. They're the underlying cause of all the instability in Africa. Well, were they always there in the last 500 years? Did they cause these problems for the last 500 years? They are a recent phenomenon. And why did they arise to begin with? This is not to defend them, by the way. I strongly believe that any act of terrorism, regardless of what it is and when it has happened in history, is abhorrent, and it should be strongly denounced, no matter who is carrying it out, no matter whether it's a state entity or a private group. I don't believe in it, and I strongly believe that they're counterproductive for society. There are political solutions, and those are to be followed. And grassroots organizing is the way to go, not armed gangs seeking unconventional warfare and killing innocent people. That's abhorrent. However, the Islamic response, organized armed response in a number of areas of Africa has come about. It has long historical roots, and it has come about because of how the militarist West acts toward Africa, whether it's Islamic Africa across the north, or sub-Saharan Africa, by the way. This does not mean that there are not local divisions, tribal divisions. Granted, if you study this Africa, by the way, you find out that there are a lot of tribal divisions. The West historically has exploited tribal divisions. Okay. China is, I think, one of the reasons that we have had a keen interest in China, in Africa. China is going to be more than likely, because I just don't see Russia. Russia is interested in it's more of the military angle, strategic issues in targeted areas in Africa, filling some of the gaps that the West is NATO countries are leaving behind. But there is going to be a new partition of Africa, and the BRICS, and this is what I want to leave you with, the BRICS group, of which, of course, Russia, both China and Russia are part, as well as South Africa, obviously, you know that, and India. India, by the way, has played a major role in Africa, in the African economy as well. The BRICS group will continue to play a more influential role. Africa, unfortunately, will remain for the foreseeable future, in my view, at the bottom of the living standards ladder on the planet. Unfortunately, although it's the richest country, it's the richest continent, sorry, it's the richest continent, 54 countries, richest continent on the planet. As far as the chocolate industry and its future, the chocolatiers and their various lobbyists and public relations firms and law firms constantly point out that they're working to fix the problem. They're constantly fixing it. They've been fixing the problem for 30 years. The problem is getting worse. And the reason the problem is getting worse is because the underlying economy back home, whether it's the Ivory Coast or Ghana or any Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, those are getting worse. Living standards, when you look at living standards of Africa, from the Great Recession of 2008, and especially after 2015, with COVID coming into 2020, you see downward living standards. Now, there are African scholars who are more optimistic, who point out, by the way, we have, by the way, South Africa and Nigeria are the largest, most populous countries, the big dogs in Africa, the big countries in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. And from there, you do have some intellectuals who argue that, we have a bright future. BRICS is coming along. There are more and more Africans educated. They're into computer science. And I think we're going to find ways for sustainable development in a number of areas. The manufacturing sector is growing. Clearly, agriculture remains the number one sector in terms of GDP, share of GDP, by the way. Okay. However, it is true that manufacturing is growing, and the reason is because Western countries and China and India are taking some of their factories, some of their worst factories, like the tannery business, for example, involving leather, into Africa. Some of the recycling business, some of the energy. So anyway, there is that. I didn't want to point a picture of total pessimism. There are scholars who say, wait a minute, there are bright points and there are bright spots. And we do have an increasingly educated population, Western educated population are coming back. They're contributing. And perhaps even child labor will go away someday. I don't see child labor in the chocolate business going away anytime soon, unless the chocolate companies simply have a strict policy of not buying the product from producers who use child labor and slave labor. They're not going to do that. It's not in their interest. So I'm not optimistic on that score. Nor am I optimistic that, although Africa, by the way, has the fastest rising population, it has enormous potential for GDP growth. Enormous, because they're starting from such a low level. Okay? Enormous potential, given that it's the richest continent, by the way. So those are my remarks. I invite your comments by all means. Anything you would like to point out. Subscribe to Asad Alim's channel. This is Asad's channel. Supply to his channel. I would love to hear from you. Asad would, as would I. We respond to whatever you write. Thank you for listening. I am very grateful to you. Thank you.